It just wasn't the right time. It's one of the most common things people say after a relationship ends. And at first, it almost feels comforting, because it takes the pressure off everything. It makes it feel like nobody did anything wrong. No one was the bad guy. No mistakes were made. It was just timing, wrong moment, wrong circumstances, wrong phase of life. And so you tell yourself, if things were different, maybe it would have worked. But what if that idea is more comforting than it is true? What if perfect timing isn't the reason things don't work out, but the explanation we use when something deeper doesn't align? Because in reality, relationships don't usually fail because the clock was wrong. They fail because something between two people wasn't aligned enough to survive the timing they were given. And that changes everything about how you understand what happened. After a breakup, the mind looks for explanations that hurt the least. And bad timing is one of the easiest explanations to accept, because it doesn't force you to pick a side. It doesn't force you to assign blame. And most importantly, it doesn't force you to accept incompatibility, because incompatibility is uncomfortable. It suggests that even if things were different, the outcome might have been the same. So instead, the mind chooses something softer. Something like, we just weren't ready yet, or we met at the wrong time. But psychologically, this is a form of emotional self-protection, because it preserves hope. It keeps the relationship alive in an alternate version of reality, a version where, under different circumstances, it could have worked. And that version feels much easier to carry than the idea that it simply wasn't a match that could survive reality. We often imagine perfect timing like a puzzle piece. Two people meet at exactly the right moment. Both are emotionally ready. Both are stable. Both are available. Both are aligned. And everything just clicks. But real relationships don't happen in controlled conditions. They happen in real life, where people are stressed, healing, distracted, growing, unsure, changing. There is rarely a perfect version of two people at the same time. So when someone says, it wasn't the right time, what they often mean is, at least one of us wasn't in a place where this could work consistently. And that's very different from timing being the main cause. Because timing doesn't create compatibility. It only reveals it. When you break it down, bad timing usually hides something more specific. It can mean one person wasn't emotionally ready for commitment. One person was still attached to their past. One person had too much going on in their life. Or the connection simply didn't grow strong enough to overcome those challenges. But instead of saying, I wasn't emotionally available, or we weren't compatible enough to push through the difficulty, it gets simplified into wrong time, because that sounds less final, less personal, less painful. But if you translate it honestly, bad timing often just means the relationship couldn't survive the reality we were in. Not because reality was unfair, but because the connection wasn't strong or aligned enough to overcome it. When something is truly aligned, timing becomes less important, not irrelevant, but less decisive. Because when two people are genuinely compatible and emotionally ready for each other, they tend to adapt. They communicate. They make space. They adjust to challenges instead of being undone by them. But when compatibility is uncertain, timing becomes the deciding factor. Small stress becomes big distance. Small confusion becomes emotional withdrawal. Small obstacles become reasons to disconnect. So timing isn't always the problem. Sometimes it's just the final condition that reveals whether something was stable enough to begin with. Few phrases are more emotionally powerful than right person, wrong time, because it allows both hope and grief to exist at the same time. Hope that it could still work someday, and grief that it didn't work now. But in reality, this phrase is often incomplete, because if someone is truly the right person for your life, the relationship doesn't collapse purely because of timing. It may be difficult. It may require growth. It may require patience. But there is usually a level of stability that remains even through imperfect circumstances. So when everything falls apart due to timing alone, it's worth asking a harder question. Was it truly the right person? Or just the right feeling at the wrong stage? Because those two things often feel identical in the beginning, but they don't behave the same under pressure. The reason bad timing feels so believable is because relationships are heavily shaped by context. Someone can care deeply about you, but still not be ready for commitment. Someone can enjoy your presence, but still not have the emotional capacity to sustain it. Someone can feel connection, but still not be in a stable place in their life. So in the moment, it genuinely feels like timing is the issue, because everything else seems right. But feelings alone don't maintain relationships. Consistency does. And when consistency breaks down, timing becomes the easiest explanation to point to. Here's the uncomfortable truth behind most bad timing situations. Even if the timing had been different, the underlying issues would likely still exist. If someone isn't emotionally available now, they may not suddenly become available later without significant change. If communication patterns don't work, they don't automatically fix themselves with time. If two people don't align in priorities or readiness, those gaps don't disappear just because circumstances shift. So waiting for better timing often becomes a way of avoiding the real question: what actually needs to change for this to work? And in many cases, that question doesn't have an easy answer. If someone tells you it wasn't the right time, the healthiest way to interpret it is not as a promise, but as information. Information about readiness, emotional availability, alignment, capacity, not necessarily about your worth, not necessarily about your value, but about what the dynamic was able to sustain at that moment. Because the goal isn't to turn every bad timing into a future possibility. The goal is to understand what didn't align, so you stop repeating the same patterns with different people. Perfect timing sounds like something missing from the equation, but more often than not, it's just a way of describing what already was in the equation. Two people, at two different levels of readiness, trying to make something work in real time. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Not because the universe got the timing wrong, but because relationships are built on more than timing alone. They're built on alignment, readiness, consistency, and mutual effort. And when those things are strong enough, timing becomes less of a barrier. Not because life is perfect, but because the connection is strong enough to move through imperfection. And maybe that's the real shift. Not trying to find the perfect time for someone, but learning to recognize when something is only surviving because of ideal conditions, instead of thriving in real ones. Because at the end of the day, love isn't just about when you meet someone. It's about what happens after you do. Before we finish, there's one more idea that's worth talking about. Because when people hear the phrase, "it just wasn't the right time," they usually think about the relationship. But very few people stop to think about what that phrase says about themselves. After all, when a relationship ends, we naturally become historians. We replay conversations. We remember the good moments. We search for the exact point where things started to change, as if finding the answer would somehow change the outcome. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes there isn't one defining moment. Sometimes relationships aren't undone by one conversation or one mistake. Sometimes they're shaped by hundreds of small moments that slowly move two people in different directions. And that's important to remember, because when we believe everything came down to timing, we also start believing that if we could somehow go back, pick a different day, send a different text, or meet under different circumstances, everything would have turned out differently. Maybe, but maybe not. Because relationships don't exist inside perfect conditions. They exist inside real life. And real life is messy. People lose jobs. Families get sick. Mental health changes. Dreams change. Goals change. Priorities change. None of those things happen because someone found the wrong person. They're simply part of being human. The healthiest relationships aren't the ones that avoid difficult seasons. They're the ones that learn how to move through them together. That's a very different way of looking at love. Instead of asking, "Did we meet at the wrong time?" you might ask, Were we able to face difficult times as a team? Because those are two completely different questions. Think about the couples you admire most. Do you think they met during a perfect chapter of life? Probably not. Some met while they were broke. Some met while building careers. Some met while grieving someone they loved. Some met while figuring themselves out. Their lives weren't perfect, but they were willing to keep choosing each other while life remained imperfect. That's an important distinction. We sometimes imagine that successful relationships happen because two people finally reach a point where everything settles down. But if you've lived long enough, you know life rarely stays settled. There is always another challenge waiting around the corner, which means if a relationship depends on everything being easy, it's going to struggle eventually. There's another side to this conversation that often gets overlooked. Sometimes people spend years waiting for better timing. They convince themselves that one day, after a promotion, after moving, after healing, after becoming more successful, then they'll finally be ready for love. Growth is important. Healing is important. Working on yourself is important. But there's a difference between preparing for life and postponing life. Sometimes, I'm waiting for the right time quietly becomes fear wearing a more acceptable disguise. Fear of vulnerability, fear of rejection, fear of commitment, fear of getting hurt again. And those fears don't always disappear with time. Sometimes they simply become more comfortable, which is why waiting alone rarely changes everything. Growth does. Self-awareness does. Honest conversations do. Time can help, but time, by itself, doesn't solve emotional patterns. People do. Maybe that's why the phrase, right person, wrong time, resonates with so many people. It gives us hope. It leaves the door slightly open. And hope isn't a bad thing. Hope helps us survive heartbreak. But hope should inspire growth, not pause your life. If years pass while you're waiting for someone to become ready, or waiting for circumstances to magically align, you may unknowingly miss opportunities to build something healthy with someone who is ready. That's why acceptance can be so powerful. Acceptance isn't saying the relationship never mattered. Acceptance isn't pretending you don't miss them. Acceptance simply means recognizing that what existed. What was meaningful, and what ended. Those truths can all exist at the same time. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside the idea of bad timing isn't about another person at all. It's about learning what you truly need from a relationship. Do you need consistency? Do you need emotional availability? Do you need someone whose goals align with yours? Do you need better communication? Every relationship teaches us something, even the ones that don't last, especially the ones that don't last. Because sometimes the greatest gift a relationship leaves behind is clarity. Clarity about who you are, clarity about what you need, and clarity about what you're no longer willing to settle for. One day, you may look back on a relationship that once felt like the right person at the wrong time. And instead, you'll see it differently. You'll realize it introduced you to a version of yourself you hadn't met before. It challenged you. It hurt you. It changed you. And because of that, you entered your next chapter with more wisdom than you had before. Not because heartbreak is something anyone wants, but because growth often asks difficult questions before it offers meaningful answers. So if you're holding on to the idea that your story ended because of timing, remember this. You don't need perfect timing to build a meaningful relationship. You need two people who are willing to keep choosing each other when life isn't perfectly timed. Because life almost never is. And maybe that's what real love has always been. Not finding someone when everything is finally perfect, but finding someone who's willing to build something real, even while life remains beautifully imperfect. Thank you for watching. If this video helped you see relationships from a different perspective, consider subscribing to The Love Lens. We explore the psychology behind love, heartbreak, attachment, and human connection, not to tell you what to think, but to help you understand why people behave the way they do. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, the healthiest relationships aren't the ones that begin at the perfect time. They're the ones where two imperfect people continue choosing each other through imperfect times.